Okay, so for this next video, we're just going to keep practicing rounding to the nearest 10, nearest 100, and I wrote out our little chant for you. So say it with me. 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, up the score. One more time. 4 or less, let it rest. 5 or more, up the score. So if your number is 1, if the place value that you're looking at to help you determine if you're rounding up or down is a 1, 2, 3, or 4, you're going to go down. So your place value that you're rounding to stays the same. 5 or more, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, your place value is going to go up. So that digit's going to go up 1 digit, and everything else becomes a 0 for both of them. So let's practice that. So here's the number 59. I'm going to underline, and I'm rounding the nearest 10. I'm going to underline my 10s, and I'm going to put an arrow to my 1s, and in this case there's a 9 in the 1s. Well, a 9 is on up the score, so I'm going to, my 10s place value is going to go up, and everything else stays the same. Or goes to 0, I'm sorry. My 10s place value goes up, and everything else goes to 0. 61, let's underline your 10s and look at your 1s place value. You have a 1 in your 1s place value. That tells me to let it rest. So the 6 is not going to do anything, and the 1 becomes a 0. So both of these numbers round to 60, even though this is 59 and this is 61, they both round to 60 because on a number line, these two numbers would be closest to 60. Let's look at 23. I'm going to underline my 2, and I'm going to look at my 1s place, which is a 3. 3 is less than 4, so my 2 is not going to do anything, and my 3 is going to become a 0. Let's look at the nearest hundreds. 147. So I'm going to underline my hundreds place and put an arrow to my tens place. And I'm looking at my tens place because it's the next place value closest to my hundreds. It's right next door. So 4 is less. You're going to let it rest, meaning the 1 does nothing, and everything else becomes a 0. 477. I'm going to underline my hundreds place value, and I'm going to put an arrow to my tens place value. 7, 5 or more, it's right there. I'm going to up the score, which means my hundreds place value is going to move up to a 500. Everything else becomes a 0. Everything else after the place value that you have underlined, after the place value that you are rounding to, that becomes a 0. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. 748, underline my 7, make an arrow to my tens, which is a 4. My 4 tells me to let it rest, so my 7 does nothing, and my 48 become a 0. So 748 rounds to 700. Now let's look at this. We're going to round these to the nearest 10. I have 3 digits, so these are in the hundreds place value, but I'm only going to be rounding into the nearest 10. So 367. I'm going to underline my tens place value and put an arrow to the place value on the right. 367. Well, 5 or more up the score, so 7 tells me to go up. So that means this 6 turns into a 7, so that's not 60 anymore. That's going to be 70. My 7 becomes a 0, and my 3 stays. Remember, I said anything after the underlined digit, any place value after becomes a 0. So 367 rounds to 370 rather than 360, because 367 is going to be closer to 370 on a number line. Let's look at 531. To the nearest 10. Underline my tens, put an arrow to the 1 place value. 1 tells me to let it rest. I'm not going to do anything with it. So 3 stays, 1 becomes a 0, and the 500 stays. Let's look at 249. To the nearest 10. underline my 10s, put an arrow to my 1s. 9 is 5 or more up the score, so my 4's got to do some work. It's going to move up. It's going to go to a 5. My 9 becomes a 0, and my 2 stays the same. 249 rounds to 250 when you're rounding to the nearest 10.